Hello, ladies and gentlemen, Gabester here. This is the raid guide for Normal and Heroic Hans'gar and Franzok. Hans and Franz. And this fight is pretty simple. It is probably one of the easier fights in the zone by far. The main difficulty is making sure that your tanks use proper cooldowns when appropriate, and that your raid members in general do their best to dodge the various plates that will come down or travel across the room. If you have a pretty solid basic setup in terms of positioning and explain the simple rules that players should follow, it's pretty difficult to screw up too badly on the plates. So let's get started. So for your raid composition, you probably don't need to really think about it too much. Obviously you need 2 tanks. I would suggest 1 healer for about every 5 people in the raid. The healing requirement is pretty lax on this fight. DPS also doesn't matter. There is a minor note that melee have a kind of annoying time chasing around the bosses when they decide to leap, but the occasions for that are not big enough or significant enough to really warrant changing your roster. So just go with what you got. It'll be fine. Now you'll notice that at the start of the fight, both Hans and Franz have 0 rage. And rage is essentially an energy that increases inversely proportional to their health. So they have 0 rage at the start when they have 100% health. When they have 60% health, they will have 100 minus that, so 40 rage, and so on. So by the end of the fight, they'll be nearing the maximum 100 rage. Rage essentially increases their damage dealt to the tanks, as well as their mechanical abilities that they have. So the basic boss mechanics that you'll see throughout the fight will become more powerful as their rage increases. And we'll talk about those in the next section here. So the first basic mechanic for the bosses is Body Slam. And this is used really on 2 different occasions. It's used when one of the bosses returns from being on the outside of the room, dealing with the plates and the environment itself. When they return, they will Body Slam at the location of the tanks. The other time it's used is by Hans himself, and he will essentially target a random range member. You can see him jumping there, actually. And this player will get a red arrow over their head. After a moment, he will leap to their location and do the Body Slam near them. And depending on his rage level, he may do repeated jumps to other players that are usually far away from his current location. So at the end of the fight, his repeated Body Slams will be 4 or 5 in a row, whereas early on it may just be 1 or 2. So the best thing to do for Body Slam that's targeted on ranged is for ranged players to spread out. The targeted person with the arrow can move away from other raid members so that no one else gets hit. And since he'll jump to generally people that are opposite his current location, if you're just spread on opposite sides of the melee clump, the tanks, etc., it makes it pretty autonomous, essentially. The Body Slam that targets tanks ideally should only hit the current tank, if possible. So that'll just involve movement. It does debuff the targeted player with a physical damage taken debuff. So if you have to tank swap for any reason, just watch those stack counts. Now Franzok has 2 main abilities. The first is Skullcracker, which targets random players and will do physical damage to them, essentially. And just like the other boss mechanics, as their rage increases, Franzok will use more Skullcracker targets at once, essentially. So by the end, he will be hitting 5 players, whereas early on it's just a couple. Overall, it's not a very dangerous ability. It's just up to the healers to keep people topped off in health so that this incidental damage that you cannot avoid is mitigated, but it's very basic. Disrupting Roar is the other ability from Franzok, and this one's far more important, I guess, to handle properly. As you might imagine, it interrupts casting, and as the rage increases, the cast time on this ability decreases, so it's more difficult to avoid being interrupted. As with most things, check the description for a link to the weak auras, where you can get a warning that'll show you when Disrupting Roar is cast, but in most boss mods will do it as well. Nothing real special, just stop casting when it's going off. So both of the plate mechanics in this fight, the Searing Plates and the Press Plates, are going to spawn based on the health levels of the bosses. So for example, the first time you'll see environmental mechanics will always be Searing Plates, which occur at about 85% health. Beware that the bosses do share health, so it doesn't matter which you're attacking. The Searing Plates have two basic setups. They will spawn in singles, like you're seeing here. So just one plate at a time will come out every 2.5 seconds. And after the first plate in the pattern has come out, a random direction will be chosen, left or right. And the next plate will be going in that direction from the original one. And this pathway or this direction will continue until the entire series of plates has commenced, and then a new pattern will emerge. The other possibility is a row of Searing Plates, which unfortunately I don't have footage of, but it's essentially a row entirely full, except for one gap in between the plates in some random location. But the basic pattern works the same. So in this case, the gap space is first selected, and then a direction right or left of that is chosen randomly, and then the gap will continue in that direction. For both the singles and the gap, if that space or the plate location hits a wall, it will then loop back on itself and go to the opposite end. So the basic idea for dodging the Searing Plates in this fight, and actually movement in general, while the conveyor belts are active, is not moving against the conveyor belts, because trying to do so will greatly hinder you. You won't really get where you're trying to go. Instead, you want to move side to side. Always try to move perpendicular to the direction of the conveyor belts. That will allow you to easily get where you're going. So for example, when you're dodging the Searing Plates, if you have the gap pattern, the row with one gap in between, if you're just moving side to side, which you should be doing, you'll easily be able to get where you need to go. The other general rule is to make sure you start centered, and then you can adjust quickly based on where you have to be. So just keep those two rules in mind, particularly for the Searing Plate management. That's the easiest way to do those. Now, press plates are the other environmental mechanic, and they're far more interesting. These can occur in a series of different patterns, which you can quickly get used to and learn. And the way the patterns work is essentially they start with the same basic structure, and once you see that initial set, you can then say, all right, I know it's this pattern or that pattern, whatever. Also, you can check the description of the video. There's a link to the Google spreadsheet that I made that shows the patterns in their full glory. At least I believe that's all of them. And you can, use that to plan ahead if you want to, but you probably don't need to. The basic rule of thumb, though, for avoiding the plates is having good initial positioning and making sure that you utilize the gap or space between the conveyor belts. So you can see that there are 4 raid markers kind of along the center line in the room, going left to right. And these are not all of, but they're some of the safe positions, or starting positions rather, for this phase. The basic rule of thumb is that you want to stand nowhere along a wall, so somewhere inside the room that's not touching a wall, at the location where 4 corners of the conveyor belts meet. So those are, you can see those 4 raid markers are just 4 examples along the center line. You can also use some to the front or the back, one gap essentially. The reason that you want to stand in these positions where the 4 corners meet is that from those positions, along the center in particular, you never have to move even a full conveyor grid space to get safe, essentially. There's always a safe location from that 4-corner position that you are touching. You just have to move at the right angle. And then once the plate hits, you step back to your corner position and, dodge the next one and so on. So if you, like I said, if you plan to position yourself accordingly when the phase starts, you can avoid moving very much at all. Now, I mentioned the gaps between the conveyor belts are particularly useful for traveling, but they have an even more important use, and that is essentially providing you a safe position between various types of plates in the room. This works for both the Searing Plates that travel along the conveyor belts and the press plates. So if you watch closely here, I think in the next set, you can start to see that I'm learning how to do the technique. The basic idea is that if you are against a position where a plate is coming down or crossing, if it's a searing plate, you can be on the gap between the conveyor belts that is up against that position. So there you can see I am there, and then I'm going right. You can be up against that position, but just on the opposite side of that gap. So it's a very slight difference. There you see I did it there. You're just slightly to the other side of where the plate is coming down. And even though you're still, technically in that gap and therefore not being pushed by the conveyor belts, you will avoid the smash damage or the searing plate damage. It does take practice. The movement that you need to move left and right in those positions is very minor, so you just have to kind of get used to it. But it does work every time if your position is precise. And so, like I said, once you get in the habit of staying at those 4 corner positions to start, then you can start also using the central gaps at all times. This will prevent you from being pushed or pulled, which is very useful for range DPS and healers and all that good stuff. So just a technique to practice and get used to. On both normal and heroic, the actual damage from getting hit by a plate is not deadly. You can take 2, 3, maybe even 4 of them if you're full health without dying, but obviously you want to avoid them as much as possible. So just do your best to practice this technique and it'll help out a lot. Before I forget, the final mechanic is Crippling Suplex, and this is a tank cooldown ability essentially. This will target both tanks simultaneously, do very, very heavy physical damage to them, and in addition to the shattered vertebrae debuff that you might get that increases physical damage, it can be quite deadly. So you need to be very careful of this. Now it's worth noting that at the time of this recording, there is a known bug with this ability which prevents tanks from using abilities when this ability is being cast. If that's still in place when you were doing the fight, it's supposed to be fixed in 6.1. But if that bug still exists, then you'll probably need to plan to use outside cooldowns on those tanks, unless the tanks can time their abilities properly. Just depends how accurate the boss mods are for when that is being cast. So just be aware of the caveat with how that ability works right now, but the basic idea is to use heavy cooldowns on the tanks so that they can survive it. So that's really it. Like I said, Hans and Franz is a pretty easy fight. Overall, it's mostly about dodging those mechanical, environmental abilities, and there's just a few basic boss mechanics, but it's pretty simple overall. So as always, thanks for watching, good luck, and see you next time. If you hit subscribe, I will pump you up. Wow. Sorry.